Recently, I did a project on ancient Greece, and a lot of the things that I found were extremely interesting. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about ancient Greece. Their diet, most of the people farmed. They farmed wheat or barley. They had grape trees. They made their own wine. The ancient Greeks did lots of drinking. And they had olive trees too that were very important because they would handpick the olives and crush them to make olive oil or like beauty products they would make from the olive. Um, and the olive trees are really important because I'm not really sure why, but if anyone pulled up an olive tree, it was considered a criminal offense. Um, A lot of their food that they ate had religious and philosophical meaning to it, like their meat. The only meat that they ate was usually deer or boar, and they only ate meat if it was a sacrifice to one of their gods. The ancient Greeks believed that they wouldn't hunt a tamed animal and kill it and eat it. It had to be hunted in the wild. And their vegetables, they thought that some were cleaner or dirtier than others. Like if it was grown above the ground or in the ground, they thought, certain ones were cleaner and dirtier. Or sometimes other people worshipped a certain god more than the others, so then they would only eat the vegetables that that particular god liked. They ate a lot of fish and bread and porridge, lots of fruit. Um, in the home was usually the mom and dad and their children. The men were involved in the politics and the farming and all the hunting. They would go out to drinking parties with their other friends, and when the men were out drinking, the women weren't allowed to be with. They weren't allowed to see the men getting drunk. The women had a very limited freedom outside of the house. They could go visit a neighbor or something if they wanted to, but only for a little time, and then they would have to go back home. They could go to like weddings and funerals, but they had to stay by their husband or by the men. But inside the house, the women were in charge of the home. They were in charge of the cleaning and cooking and supposed to have the kids and all that. The children, the girls, would stay home until they were married. They were supposed to help the mother with the cooking and cleaning, and the boys would start school around age 6 or 7. And it was usually like a boarding school, or the boys could go outside and play. They could play the old Olympian games. And back then in ancient Greece, the games were more like wrestling or running or board games like chess or checkers. Um, the men got married at around age 25 to 30, and the girls were about age 12 or 16. Girls of richer families sometimes got married younger. Um, they, when the dad of the girl found a guy that he wanted his daughter to marry, the two dads would get together and discuss money, and and then they would arrange the marriage. And sometimes the couple didn't even meet until the day of the wedding. They would have the ceremony, they would have a party, and the parents of the girl would present a dowry, which was usually a piece of land or like some cows or sheep, or like jewelry. And then the girl would move in. And if the parents of the man were still alive, sometimes the couple would live with his parents, or if there were any unmarried sisters still living there, then they would also live with them. And as long as the girl stayed in the house with this guy, they were considered legally married. But if the girl moved out, then that meant that they were divorced. And divorce was very common back then. If they got a divorce, the husband would have to give back the dowry, so the girl would have something to live on. And if they had any children, then the children would stay with the father and learn how to run the farm, or if they had a family business, they would learn how to take over that. They had lots of dances. They had a dance for everything, pretty much. The dances were very important. They thought that the dances were good for their emotional and physical health. The men and women rarely danced together. Usually the men danced with men and the women with other women. They had over 200 ancient Greek dances. They had different dances for war, religion, weddings, funerals, celebrations. They had a different dance for everything. They did have slaves. There was different ways you could become a slave. You could be born into slavery, or you could be bought, or you could give yourself to be a slave. Like if you were poor and you didn't have anywhere to live, you could offer to be a slave in exchange for like food and a place to live and clothes. The slaves were to help the women in the house with the cooking and the cleaning, or tutoring the younger children in the house. The slaves were treated very, very well. They got to attend celebrations, funerals, weddings. They were treated as a member of the family. Religion was very ritual, very nature-based for ancient Greeks. They were polytheistic, which means they worshipped many gods. They believed that the gods were to protect them and guide them. They did lots of rituals and ceremonies. They thought that they needed to please the gods in order to have a good life. They made sacrifices. They had temples and statues built that where they would go to offer their sacrifices, and normally it was an animal sacrifice. One of their gods, his name was Zeus. He was their king of gods, thunder, lightning, gold, and kings. He was like their main god, kind of in charge of it all. They had another god named Poseidon, was god of the sea, and they thought that he either had a good side or a bad side. If he was in a good mood, he would make the land fertile and the sea calm. He would let them have good fishing. But if he was in a bad mood, they thought that he would make earthquakes and storms at sea. So they thought it was very important to be worshiping him. They had another god named Hades, who was god of the underworld, death and the dead. His story was he wanted a wife, and so he challenged his brother Zeus for one of his wives. And the daughter that Zeus gave, Hades, Hades knew that she was against this marriage, so he kidnapped her instead and took her down to the underworld with him. And when the girl's mother found out, she put a dark earth over the entire earth until her daughter was returned to her. So when her daughter was brought back, it turned out that she had ate this pomegranate seed down in the underworld. And I never found out what that meant. But so for a certain part of the year, she always had to return back to Hades in the underworld and live there for certain times of the year. They had a goddess named Athena. She was goddess of Athens, war and handicrafts and wisdom. And then they had Apollo, who was god of light, purity, guidance, and healing and music. He was their athletic one, their great Olympian. And then they had Aphrodite. She was goddess of love and beauty. And they believed that she had this magic girdle that she could make anyone she wanted fall in love with her. They used the gods to explain things that happened that they didn't understand, like the sun rising and setting. They thought that the gods controlled that. They did have a goddess of all things nature and earth, and they thought that she was represented by the moon. Um, the ancient Greeks believed in the afterlife. They thought that when they died, their soul went and lived on in someone else. And when you got buried, you were buried with goods and wealth that you had accumulated in your life. And they buried you with these things to take care of you in your next life. Usually they were like clothes or food, weapons, money, and then the kings were usually buried with bronze weapons. They did have witches. Witchcraft was known as the old religion. They had lots of rituals, prayers, and meditation. The witches believed that the gods lived all around them and within them. The witches didn't have any churches or temples. They were more nature-based, so all of their rituals and ceremonies were done outside, like in nature. They did do magic at certain times of the moon phase, but no black magic. They believed in the threefold law, that whatever they did would come back to them 3 times more, so they never harmed anyone. And the witches did not believe in the afterlife like the other Greeks. They thought that once you died, you went up to the gods and you just didn't come back. Their healthcare was also very religious. They had a philosopher named Hippocrates. He had the 4 humors theory, that he thought that the body was made up of 4 main components and that they all needed to be in balance in order to be healthy. And the 4 components, he came up with that they were the liquids in the body, like your blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And like the example that I found was if someone had a fever, that meant that there was too much blood in the body. So what they would do was bleed out the patient. But Hippocrates, he didn't believe in magic, that magic could cure or cause diseases. He wasn't superstitious, so his methods, it took people a while to get used to his methods because they were still all about the magic and the superstition, because that was how it had always been. He thought that the doctors should look at each person as an individual and do something based on their symptoms, because everyone was kind of treated the same because they would just try magic or they would pray to the gods for whatever disease you had. And he thought that people should be treated on a more individual basis. And surgery, it was very rare to have surgery back then because they weren't very sanitary, they didn't have anesthetic, so surgery was always a last resort, and back then it never went well. I also looked at Greece today, and they still do their religious festivals, they still have a lot of dancing, they're still superstitious, mostly 97% Christian Orthodox, the witches are gone. Some are Muslims, Roman Catholic, or Jewish.